day of resistance has been declared as the controversial reasonableness standard bill is considered, prompting nationwide protest and heightened concerns over anti-corruption efforts and individual rights. Vhal Divinagracia reports.
On Monday, Israel's Knesset voted on the first reading of one of the controversial bills called Reasonableness Standard Bill. The proposed law would limit the court's ability to evaluate lawmakers' decisions by preventing judicial review of government administrative actions deemed beyond what a responsible authority would do. In response, protest leaders have declared Saturday a day of resistance, with demonstrations across the country to start on Tuesday, including a major protest at Ben Gurion Airport. On the other hand, supporters argue the bill prevents judicial activism, while critics believe it hampers anti-corruption efforts and individual rights protection. If the bill becomes law, it could impact previous court rulings, potentially allowing the reappointment of a minister with criminal convictions. The coalition aims to pass the bill before the Knesset summer recess. The growing intensity of protests reflects concerns about the concentration of power and potential harm to the economy and national security. This is Vhal Divinagracia, reporting SMNI News.
The United States will continue with its plan to send forbidden weapons of war to help Ukrainians in its fight against Russian forces, despite opposition from NATO allies and international organizations. Meanwhile, America also said that Ukraine is not yet ready to join the NATO alliance. Carlo de la Peña tells us more.
The White House on Friday announced that the U.S. will supply Ukraine with cluster-style artillery rounds with the aim of exerting pressure on Russia to de-escalate the conflict and to help Ukraine with weapons. The move to provide these forbidden weapons of war is part of America's new military aid package worth $800 million for Ukraine, which includes the provision of cluster munitions. The package reportedly includes 155mm artillery rounds, including dual-purpose improved conventional munitions or DPICM, and 105mm artillery rounds. But what are cluster munitions, and why is it considered a forbidden weapon of war? Cluster munitions are banned in more than 100 countries, including some NATO members, under the UN Convention on Cluster Munitions signed in 2008 and took effect in 2010. The agreement prohibits the use, stockpiling, or transfer of such weapons, as it releases many bomblets over a vast area once they detonate. These unexploded elements thus pose severe risks to civilians that will span for years. The munitions have also caused controversies over their failure or dud rate, and unexploded mini-bombs can linger on the ground for years, even decades, and then detonate indiscriminately. Countries like Russia and Ukraine have not joined the UN treaty. US has also not joined the ban but has prohibited exports of such ammo with a dud rate or bomblet failure rates of more than 1%. It can be noted that the US president can override such prohibitions in cases that are deemed in the interests of the national security of US. And according to the U.S. Department of Defense report, the U.S. Army has about 638.3 million cluster submunitions, while the U.S. Marine Corps has about 53.3 million. America's move to provide cluster munitions to Kiev is in contrast to what the White House said early on in the conflict when asked about Russia's use of cluster munitions. On February 28, 2022, former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that the use of cluster munitions could potentially be regarded as a war crime.
There are reports of illegal cluster bombs and vacuum bombs being used by the Russians. If that's true, what is the next step of this administration, and is there a red line for how much violence will be tolerated against civilians in this manner that's illegal and potentially a war crime?
It would be. I don't have any confirmation of that. We have seen the reports. If that were true, it would potentially be a war crime.
But more than a year since the conflict started, the Biden administration decided to provide such weapons to Ukraine. In an exclusive interview with CNN, U.S. President Joe Biden defended his country's move to send cluster munitions to Ukraine, saying that it was a very difficult decision to make. Biden added the U.S. had first consulted with its allies, stressing that Ukraine is running out of ammunition, which is why the United States is sending them, and that it had taken him a while to be convinced to do it. But he had done it because they are running out of ammunition. However, many of America's allies strongly expressed their opposition to the said decision, and these include NATO members Canada, the United Kingdom, and Germany. The United States, as well as the EU member countries, Austria and Spain, also opposed America's move. The Human Rights Watch also urged the U.S. not to proceed with its decision and criticized both Russia and Ukraine for using cluster munitions in the conflict. The United States, however, will continue to push through with its decision, and when asked about the potential harm to the civilian population that the cluster munitions would inflict in Ukraine, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colin Kahl said, "The worst thing for civilians in Ukraine is for Russia to win."
And look, I'm as concerned about the humanitarian circumstance as anybody. But the worst thing for civilians in Ukraine is for Russia to win the war. And so it's important that they don't.
According to the official, Ukraine made a written promise not to use the munitions in civilian-populated areas. Russia has condemned America's decision and called it as an act of desperation, but it believes that it will not affect its ongoing military operations in Ukraine. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden said that Ukraine is not ready to join NATO, the intergovernmental military alliance of countries from Europe and North America. It can be remembered that NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg has said that Ukraine could only join the alliance if it wins the war against Russia. Reporting, this has been Carlo de la Peña, SMNI News.